Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ioulia Velisaratou. I'm journalist for Mega and Tuan TV. It's a member of Alter Ego Media Corporation, and I'm honored to welcome here in Delphi Economic Forum Yanzhong Huang is a senior fellow for global health at the Council of Foreign Relations. I'm honored to moderate this fireside, Mr. Yanzhong Huang. And I would like to put you the first question. It's a question that I haven't thought a lot, but I think that has a connection with the place that hosts the great event. As we know from the ancient history, the Greeks used to go to Oracle of Delphi to ask about something that occupied themselves. The most common question in the ancient history was when the war will end. If we were in ancient times and we go to Pythia to ask about something, for you, what would be the question?
Okay, well, thank you, Ioulia, for that great question. Right? And well, certainly, I think it would. I would ask about the war. We are. Certainly, this is war in Ukraine, but in the meantime, we're fighting a smaller predator, right? That is the virus. So I would like, when will the pandemic be over?
Excellent. So let's go to our first question. After 2 years of global pandemic, the virus is still here and affects our lives still. According to your opinion, what are the main reasons that the world couldn't manage to control or extinguish the virus? Do you think that it's the World Health Organization delayed declaring the outbreak or China's unwillingness to cooperate?
Well, great question, right? Certainly when we are in a pandemic, people naturally would turn to the World Health Organization, the WHO, right? Because it's supposed to be the leader, right, to coordinate the global response to the pandemic. And to be fair, WHO indeed played an important role in this process. They have been very, responsive in terms of seeking information, from Beijing on, the outbreak when it occurred in December, end of December 2019. They helped coordinate international research and development on vaccines, therapeutic means, and diagnostics. In the meantime, I think they over-relied on the information provided by the government. That in a way explains why there's a delay in declaring the public health emergency of international concern. And also they were not very coherent or in a way inconsistent in terms of the enforcing the international health regulations over issues like travel and trade. There's also this issue on how to assess the China's response to the pandemic. Initially, the praise by China's response by setting a standard for the world in responding to the pandemic. But now certainly with this zero COVID strategy implemented in China, this international reverence for China's approach is in decline. But we talk about WHO, but in the meantime, we have to keep in mind this WHO decision-making is a member state-driven process, So you cannot simply blame WHO for causing all the problems, because in fact, the international health regulations, when it was negotiated, the revision was negotiated into after SARS outbreak, they actually emphasized the state sovereignty, right? But we know that states tend to be reluctant to declare outbreaks in their region. They also had incentives to cover up. This is causing the problems for a coordinated international response. And in the meantime, we talk about the securitization, right? When you are facing a pandemic, we respond in a way, that like this is an emergency that requires by actions, by out of the ordinary, by the transcending normal political boundaries, right? And this also sort of relieves the wealthy states, right, the obligation to help other countries in responding to the pandemic, because this is the national security problem, right? We have to protect our people first.
Okay, as you've mentioned in the your first answer, you said that China has a zero COVID policy, and we can see that West and China have total different approach as far as the COVID-19 is concerned. And after the global vaccination campaign, we see that China is very persistent to follow this zero COVID policy. Do you think that China reacts like it doesn't believe in the efficacy of the vaccination, or it's a political matter?
Well, there was a saying in China, if you want to have friends in China, you got to be very careful, right? Don't mention, right, this debate between zero COVID or peaceful coexistence with the virus. So this represents two different methods, but to the Chinese leaders, it's more than that, because this whole issue has been so politicized and now framed as a competition between two governance approaches, two political systems, even between two civilizations. But initially, when that approach was kicked off, right, that was in March 2020, they wanted basically, right, to maintain the extremely low level of infection after the Wuhan outbreak, to buy time for the vaccines. But of course, the vaccines that they developed and distributed, right, had problems in terms of preventing infections because of the low efficacy rates. So that makes the zero COVID strategy more justifiable, right? And although it's less justifiable from a public health the standpoint, especially if you consider there's huge immunity gap between China and the rest of the world, because a very small fraction of 1% of the Chinese people were exposed to the virus, and then the low the efficacy rate of the Chinese vaccines. Right? So that means the large percentage of the population, actually very vulnerable to the virus. So the Chinese leaders, decision makers, are very concerned about this worst case scenario, right? That is, if they open up, right, then it's going to repeat what happened in the 16th century when the conquistadors arrived in the New World, bringing with them, the deadly smallpox, right? Wiped off, right? Essentially a large segment of the native population, right there. So I think they were obsessed with the worst case scenario, even though I think that scenario is sort of being exaggerated, but it's more than that. It's in politics again. The Chinese leaders, simply do not want to give up that strategy, because giving up means that they admitting that this strategy doesn't work. It means that their political system is not superior to the Western liberal democracy. So that raised the political stakes, making it difficult for China to pivot away from this approach.
Mm-hmm. According to your book, Toxic Politics, you have mentioned that between China's political health and its physical health, it also reveals a political system that is remarkably resilient but fundamentally flawed. Do you think COVID-19 for China is beyond all means, as you have already mentioned, a political and then a health matter, but against the West? I mean, it wants to have a total different approach because there is a global governance that aspires to do it.
Well, yeah. So with that model, I built in the book, right? especially that public policy process, right, the pollution control can be used also to explain why the pathogen control in China. When we talk about the decision making, especially the policy implementation, the perverse incentive structure, right, created from this top down, right, the policy structure. All this, the problems, like overkill, one size fits all, right? The Chinese called 层层加码, that is, the requirements become more stringent, when it goes to the lowest level of implementation. Mm-hmm. But in the meantime, that system is indeed very resilient. The state remains very strong. That as long as there's a will, right, there's the ability to get things done. I think if we talk about the zero COVID, if there's a country that can still sustain that approach, it got to be China.
Mm-hmm. So in recent article in Washington, in recent article that you have already written in Washington Post, you mentioned that China is dramatically different as the city host of the Winter Olympics than Summer Olympics in Beijing 14 years, after 14 years. You have mentioned, I take the quote, not only is teaching English increasingly discouraged, but a few weeks ago, the Beijing municipal government replaced English words on the subway. Beijing rejected some health protocols recommended by the International Olympic Committee and is pursuing its own outbreak control strategy. These developments signal a radical change in China's stance toward the outside world. Can you please explain this to us?
Well, basically, it shows China becomes more self-confident, right? This makes sense, right? When the country is becoming more powerful, more influential, it's more willing to play by its own rules. We saw that certainly during the Winter Olympics, right? That they sort of rejected the IOC's, the proposal, and insisted to use their own approach in set up those, those Olympic bubbles, right? Mm-hmm. Actually, it worked, right? Because they managed to prevent the spread of the virus inside and outside the bubbles during the Winter Olympics. But it also, right? I think this confidence is being strengthened during the pandemic. When they look at this perceived this performance gap between China and the Western liberal democracies, right? One thing that they keep pointing out, right? The Western failure, right, is this: the U.S. 1 million people died of COVID, but in China, right, since over the past 14 months, there were only 2 deaths, right, in the country. Of course, it depends, I think how you define, right, the COVID-caused death. But this self-confidence, right, then intertwined with the rising nationalism, that sort of noted indeed, right, this new attitude toward the West. I won't say this is necessarily hostility, but according to Yanzhong, a leading China scholar, he talked about this Gen Z population in China, believe that only China is just. The other countries, especially the West, are evil, right? So certainly the Western response to China's emergence, rise, reinforced that view, right? Not surprisingly, any criticism in China now is considered like anti-China, and there's indeed a sea change in the public's attitude, toward the Western countries. That may also explain why disinformation is such a big problem there, because people have only limited and one-dimensional information access there. It's more likely to buy in those controlled and contrived information on issues like the origins of the pandemic, on issues like the effectiveness of the Western vaccines, etc.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. I would like to mention that this approach, China's approach, is the same about the war in Ukraine. China is the only ally that avoids the words war or invasion and has never accused Russia of the killings of innocent people. Does this imply, according to your opinion, the Chinese ambition not only to assume leadership in global health governance, but in a new world order with Russia and India against the declining West?
Yeah, I'm not sure whether this shows the emergence of the new world order. Maybe Susan and my friend Chang will explain that in the next session. But I think this certainly shows there's a new divide, right? That certainly there's a Western camp, but there's also this camp, that represented by China, Russia, and India. It's even the number, right? It seems to be small, but if you look at the population, right, it's like 40% of the world's total population, representing 1/4 of the world's GDP, right? So it's actually a significant force, right? And certainly, right, as we talk about that last night, but these three countries, they're not allies. If they're allies, it's more like unholy alliances, right? Based on their, sort of dislike of the Western attitudes, right? Russia, really doesn't have much to offer to China with only a GDP, that is equivalent of one of Chinese province, right? And India, has territorial dispute with China. It's unlikely for them to form a solid alliance against Western countries. But in a way, what indeed challenge, right, the liberal, right, the rules-based international order, right? If you could look at the three countries, right, the China's authoritarian state, Russia certainly, right, that is one, and India used to be considered the largest democracy, right? It's more like what people call electoral autocracy, right? But in the meantime, it may also facilitate the fulfillment of the Chinese global ambitions. My former CFI colleague, Liz Economy, just published a book, The World According to China, made it very clear, right, that this China's global ambitions is real, whether that the President Xi indeed wants to claim the global leadership. Right? So if cornered by the Western countries, right, I think that hostility, right, will justify, right, the China to develop closer relationship with India, Russia, against the Western liberal democracies.
Okay, now we have just about 3 minutes. Do you want to send a message to the people about your prediction or your wish about what is going to happen with the virus? Do you see that there are some variants that are circulating all the time and the virus is never extinguished or containing? So what is your prediction about the virus? What is its future?
Well, I'm not the epidemiologist, but now we're in the Western countries, it's very clear, right, that we are experiencing a unsecuritization process, that we no longer treat this COVID as, sort of like a public health emergency, right? We are learning to live with the virus, right? It's very, well, we are sitting here, right, without masks, right? It shows how, this is no longer such a major concern, but in certain countries, some other countries like China, right, this is still, right, a big deal, right? Even, right, a symptomatic case, that needs to be quarantined, right, in the designated quarantine centers. I just read that this reports, right, that there's the healthcare worker in this quarantine center was actually collapsed, because he was so exhausted, and there were a bunch of the so-called COVID patients. Actually, they worked very fast and vigorously to take him to the ER rooms, right? So it's the trajectory of the virus is not just determined by the developments in the biological world. It also is determined by the developments, right, our response, right, in the political world. Right? I think as long as the virus is still there, right, we cannot rule out the possibility, right, of the emergence of the new variant, possibly even highly transmissible, right, and hopefully not as dangerous, that continue to define, right, our relationship with the microbial world, as well as our relationship with countries like China.
Professor, I'm honored to have this very useful conversation, and I think that you enlighten us with the many, many topics. Thank you very much.
Thank you.